There are Mexicans in Kansas? Who knew? When one typically thinks about where Mexican Americans live, generally a few places come to mind: the Southwest, Chicago, and maybe even New York City. Historically, however, there has been movement from Mexico in the Southwest to the Midwest outside of these large pockets of Mexican population since the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s. Additionally, groups of migrants from Texas settled in the Midwest from the 40s to the 70s, largely pulled by the Bracero program and farm work in the Great Lakes region, but they also settled in central states such as Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. These central states are characterized by rural towns and small to medium sized cities, spaces unlike the large urban environments most Mexican Americans live in. The presence of these largely unknown populations brings to mind three questions. How have members of the Mexican diaspora been received by older established communities in the Midwest? How do they organize themselves and attempt to maintain their sense of Mexican cultural identity? And lastly, how do these populations choose to identify? Hispanic, Latinx, or Chicanx? A 2006 New York Times article discusses the presence of a significant Mexican American community in the small town of Liberal, Kansas. 43% of Liberal, a town of 20,000, identified as Latino as of 2000, up from just 10% in 1980, largely brought by the growth of the meatpacking industry. In the article, non Latinx residents of the town are recorded to hold fairly stereotypical views of Mexican Americans. For example, one man, Fred Sanders, said, "They work hard and don't cause too much trouble, so I guess it's been good for these parts." The idea that Mexicans are hardworking and law abiding seems to be directly taken from the rationalizations used by lobbyists for large agricultural producers at the end of the 20th century, such as that of economist Victor S. Clarke in 1908. Mexicans are docile, patient, usually orderly in camp, fairly intelligent under competent supervision, obedient, and cheap. While it is unsurprising that older communities in a town like Liberal might hold these views, the vocalization of such an opinion shows us that the presence of Mexican Americans is not completely rejected by earlier established communities. The article also gives us insight into how the Mexican American community of Liberal is organizing themselves. First, it mentions that there are many stores and restaurants that cater to the Mexican population, including bakeries, Mexican food stands, and a Spanish language radio. From this description, we can gather that they attempt to continue their culture through businesses and radio stations catering to the specific needs of the community. Second, it asserts that there are Latinx community leaders who are trying to organize the Mexican community into a political force and gain representation in the state. One of the organizers the New York Times interviewed, Gasmina Hidalgo, stated, "People do not realize a lot of us are from here. We do need more political leaders, and maybe a demonstration is a step." Another organizer that the New York Times interviewed, Concha Aragon, also commented on the lack of visibility of Latinxes and the efforts on the organizers' parts to gain representation. In response to the question, "What? There are Hispanics in Southwest Kansas?" Aragon answered, "Yes, and we're taking action." As we can see from these two examples, alongside the political organizing the article mentions for immigration law reform, we can see that even in small Mexican communities, there are concerted efforts to fight for their rights. And, in terms of how the Mexican community in Kansas identifies, we see that Aragon uses the term Hispanic and organized for an advocacy group called Hispanos Unidos, Hispanics United, in Ulysses, Kansas. Her use of the term suggests that the community refers to themselves as Hispanic, rather than Chicanx, Latinx, or any gendered variant of those terms. To return to our questions on the identity, cultural continuity, and perception of little-known Mexican American populations, the case study of the community of Liberal, Kansas gives us a few conclusions. First, Mexican Americans seem to identify as Hispanic in Kansas. Second, businesses and radio stations catering to the community work towards preserving Mexican culture. And finally, while a level of racism persists, there is not outright rejection of the presence of Mexican Americans. While these conclusions are based on what is observed in Liberal, they may be applicable to similarly unknown Mexican communities in the Midwest, and even other parts of the country, such as the Northeast and the South, where people of Mexican descent form a smaller portion of the Latinx population.